On May 2, 2011, the world's most wanted man had no idea that his decade-long game of hide-and-seek was about to end in the most violent way possible. Osama bin Laden was living in what appeared to be plain sight, a compound in Pakistan that would become his tomb. What happened in those final hours was the culmination of the largest intelligence operation in modern history, involving betrayal, deception, and surveillance that would make any paranoid dictator lose sleep. The man who had evaded capture for nearly 10 years was about to discover that his carefully constructed fortress was nothing more than an elaborate trap. Tonight, we'll walk through those final, terrifying hours. From the moment the helicopters lifted off in Afghanistan to the gunshots that ended the most expensive manhunt in human history. The three-story compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan, where Osama bin Laden spent his final years, was built like a fortress designed by someone expecting war. 8 times larger than neighboring homes, surrounded by walls up to 18 feet high, topped with barbed wire. It had no telephone lines, no internet connection, and no trash collection. The residents burned their garbage in the courtyard, creating an isolated bubble that seemed designed to keep the world out. But isolation breeds suspicion, and by 2010, this unusual compound had caught the attention of Pakistani intelligence officers who found its security measures excessive for the area. The property, valued at over $1 million, sat in a neighborhood where most homes cost a fraction of that amount. 2 families lived there, the bin Laden family on the top floor and their couriers below, maintaining an elaborate fiction that would soon unravel. The compound's design revealed the paranoia of its most famous resident. Windows on the upper floors were tinted and positioned to prevent anyone from seeing inside. The building had no balconies facing outward, and the few that existed looked only into the internal courtyard. Every architectural choice seemed calculated to hide rather than welcome. Intelligence analysts would later discover that bin Laden rarely left the 3rd floor, spending months at a time without stepping outside. His world had shrunk to a few rooms where he watched news coverage of his own exploits, recorded propaganda videos, and planned operations that would never come to fruition. The man who had once commanded global networks of terrorists had become a prisoner in his own fortress. The compound's fatal flaw wasn't its design. It was the people who serviced it. A Pakistani intelligence report from 2010 noted that the residents never invited local children to play in their large courtyard, never participated in community events, and never allowed repairmen or delivery personnel beyond the outer gates. In a culture built on hospitality and community connections, such behavior was not just unusual, it was suspicious. What bin Laden didn't know was that his careful isolation had already marked him for death. CIA analysts were building a pattern of life assessment, tracking every movement, every visitor, and every unusual behavior around the compound. The fortress that was supposed to protect him was becoming his death sentence. But the intelligence community still needed proof that the world's most wanted terrorist was actually inside those walls. That proof would come through one of the most sophisticated surveillance operations ever conducted, and it would reveal something that would shock even experienced intelligence officers. By early 2011, the CIA had deployed an unprecedented level of surveillance around the Abbottabad compound. Satellite imagery captured movement patterns. Thermal imaging tracked body heat signatures, and human intelligence assets monitored the daily routines of everyone connected to the property. What they discovered painted a picture of a man living in constant fear. The figure intelligence analysts codenamed the Pacer appeared regularly on satellite images, walking the same path in the compound's courtyard for exactly 47 minutes each day. The timing never varied by more than a few minutes, and the route was always identical, a precise rectangle that kept him away from areas where he might be visible from outside the walls. Height analysis suggested this figure was significantly taller than the other residents, matching bin Laden's known physical characteristics. Intelligence reports from this period describe a man whose daily routine had become a prison of his own making. He woke before dawn, performed prayers facing Mecca, and then began his daily walk, the only exercise he allowed himself in an increasingly confined world. The Pacer never varied his route, never walked with others, and never appeared to engage in casual conversation with anyone in the courtyard. The psychological profile being developed by CIA analysts painted a disturbing picture. Here was a man now reduced to walking the same 47 steps every day, surrounded by walls he could never cross. His world had become smaller than that of most maximum security prisoners, yet he remained there by choice, knowing that stepping outside meant almost certain death or capture. Intercepted communications revealed another layer of bin Laden's deteriorating situation. His courier networks were fragmenting, his financial resources were dwindling, and several of his most trusted associates had been killed or captured in previous operations. The man who once commanded a global terrorist organization was increasingly isolated, dependent on a handful of loyal supporters who were themselves under constant surveillance. Perhaps most telling were the security measures bin Laden had implemented within his own home. Intelligence reports suggest he slept in a different room each night, rotating between 3 bedrooms on the top floor. He had stockpiled enough food and water to survive a siege lasting several weeks, and had established multiple escape routes within the compound, though none led beyond its walls. The final piece of intelligence that sealed his fate came from an unexpected source. Local Pakistani children reported seeing unusual activity at the compound, clothes hanging on lines that were much larger than those worn by the other residents. When combined with other evidence, this seemingly insignificant detail confirmed what intelligence analysts had suspected for months. By April 2011, President Obama was presented with intelligence assessments ranging from 30 to 95% certainty that Osama bin Laden was living in the Abbottabad compound. The variation in confidence levels reflected the stakes involved. A failed operation could destroy diplomatic relations with Pakistan and potentially allow bin Laden to escape once and for all. But the intelligence was as strong as it was ever likely to get, and the window of opportunity was closing. The decision to proceed with the operation would set in motion events that would transform bin Laden's final day from routine imprisonment into 12 hours of escalating terror. May 2nd, 2011, began like any other day for the residents of the Abbottabad compound. Intelligence reconstructions suggest bin Laden woke at approximately 4:30 a.m., performed his morning prayers, and began what would be his final daily routine. He had no way of knowing that 160 miles away in Afghanistan, 2 modified Black Hawk helicopters were being prepared for a mission that would end his life before sunrise the following day. The morning routine that intelligence analysts had observed for months proceeded exactly as expected. Bin Laden took his daily walk in the courtyard, following the precise path that satellite imagery had recorded hundreds of times before. The 47-minute walk that had become his only connection to the outside world was being observed in real time by CIA operatives who were counting down the hours until his death. What makes this final day particularly haunting is how ordinary it appeared to be. Bin Laden reviewed correspondence from his dwindling network of supporters, recorded portions of what would become his final propaganda video, and participated in the mundane household activities that had filled his years in hiding. He had no indication that this Tuesday would be different from the hundreds that had preceded it. Intelligence reports suggest that bin Laden spent considerable time that day reviewing news coverage of the Arab Spring uprisings that were reshaping the Middle East. The peaceful nature of these revolutions seemed to contradict everything he had stood for throughout his career. For a man who had dedicated his life to his cause, these developments must have been deeply disturbing. The compound's other residents followed their usual routines as well. The courier families maintained their cover stories. The women prepared meals according to their established schedule, and the children played in areas of the compound where they wouldn't be visible to outside surveillance. None of them knew that detailed plans for their deaths were being finalized at a military base in Afghanistan. As evening approached, bin Laden participated in what would be his final family dinner. Intelligence reconstructions suggest this was a larger gathering than usual, with multiple generations present in the compound's main dining area. The conversation, according to later testimony from survivors, focused on everyday concerns, children's education, household management, and discussions about current events that seemed disconnected from the reality of their situation. What bin Laden couldn't have known was that every aspect of this final day was being monitored by an intelligence apparatus that had been watching his every move for months. His daily walk had been timed to the minute. His meal schedules had been documented, and even the number of people present for dinner had been confirmed through thermal imaging. The irony of his final day is profound. A man who had spent years in hiding was himself completely unaware that the most sophisticated military operation in modern history was already in motion against him. As he prepared for what he assumed would be another night of restless sleep in his fortress, Navy SEALs were conducting final equipment checks and reviewing architectural diagrams of his home. But the most chilling aspect of bin Laden's final day wasn't what he did, it was what he didn't do. There were no final messages to his followers, no dramatic pronouncements, and no apparent recognition that his time was running out. The man who had declared himself a holy warrior spent his last day in the mundane routine of a suburban recluse, unaware that his reckoning was less than 12 hours away. At 11 p.m. on May 2, 2011, two helicopters lifted off from a military base in Jalalabad, Afghanistan, carrying 23 Navy SEALs and a military dog toward their target 160 miles away. The men aboard these aircraft knew they were embarking on the most significant counterterrorism operation in American history, but they had no way of knowing that their target was, at that very moment, preparing for bed in the compound they would assault in less than 90 minutes. The flight path had been planned to avoid Pakistani radar installations in populated areas, taking the helicopters through mountainous terrain that would mask their approach until the final moments. Intelligence reports indicate that bin Laden went to sleep sometime around 11:30 p.m., unaware that death was approaching at 160 miles per hour through the darkness above the Pakistani countryside. The operational plan called for a rapid insertion under cover of darkness, with one helicopter delivering SEALs to the compound's courtyard, while the second provided overwatch and backup. The entire operation was expected to last no more than 30 minutes, sufficient time to kill or capture bin Laden and extract before Pakistani military forces could respond effectively. What makes these final hours particularly intense is the level of real-time intelligence being gathered as the operation proceeded. Satellite imagery was providing continuous surveillance of the compound, confirming that the residents were following their normal nighttime routines. Thermal imaging showed the expected number of heat signatures in their usual locations, with the largest figure, presumed to be bin Laden, located on the third floor of the main building. The helicopters approached the compound at approximately 12:30 a.m. on May 3rd, flying low to avoid detection and using modified rotors designed to reduce noise signatures. Despite these precautions, residents of the surrounding neighborhood later reported hearing unusual aircraft sounds in the minutes before the assault began. Inside the compound, however, there were no indications that anyone was aware of the approaching danger. Intelligence reconstructions suggest that bin Laden was awakened by the sound of the helicopters just moments before the assault began. The man who had evaded capture for nearly 10 years suddenly found himself facing the realization that his greatest fear was becoming reality. The fortress that had protected him for 6 years was about to become his tomb. The first helicopter encountered mechanical difficulties during the insertion, crash landing in the compound's courtyard in a controlled descent that immediately alerted everyone inside to the fact that they were under attack. The crash created a sound that neighbors later described as explosive, shattering the silence of the residential neighborhood and announcing to bin Laden that his years of hiding had come to an end. Within seconds of the crash landing, SEALs were moving through the compound with methodical precision, clearing rooms and neutralizing resistance as they advanced toward the third floor, where intelligence indicated their primary target was located. The man who had evaded capture for nearly 10 years now had minutes, perhaps only seconds, left to live. But bin Laden's final moments would prove to be far more complex and disturbing than anyone had anticipated. The assault on the compound began at exactly 12:47 a.m. local time on May 3, 2011. Within the first 60 seconds, Navy SEALs had breached the outer walls and were moving through the compound with lethal efficiency. Intelligence reports indicate that bin Laden was awake and aware of the attack from the moment the first helicopter crash-landed in his courtyard, giving him approximately 4 minutes to contemplate his approaching death. The SEALs' advance through the compound was methodical and brutal. Resistance came primarily from the courier families living on the lower floors, who were killed quickly as the assault team moved toward their primary objective. The sound of gunfire echoed through the building as bin Laden, trapped on the third floor, realized that his carefully constructed security measures were proving useless against a determined military assault. Survivors later described hearing bin Laden moving between rooms on the third floor in those final minutes, apparently searching for weapons or escape routes that didn't exist. The man who had spent years preparing for this moment discovered that all his planning had been inadequate. The compound that had seemed like an impregnable fortress was being systematically cleared by professionals who had trained for months specifically for this assault. As SEALs reached the second floor, bin Laden's options were rapidly disappearing. Intelligence reports suggest he spent his final minutes attempting to barricade himself in his bedroom, pushing furniture against the door in a desperate attempt to delay the inevitable. The psychological terror he must have experienced, knowing that highly trained operatives were advancing toward him with the specific mission of ending his life, represented the final moments of a man who had lived in hiding for nearly a decade. The final confrontation occurred at approximately 12:51 a.m., when SEALs breached the third-floor bedroom where bin Laden had taken refuge. Multiple accounts describe him attempting to use one of his wives as a human shield when the door was breached, a cowardly act that revealed the true nature of a man who had spent his career hiding behind ideology while others fought for his cause. The engagement lasted less than 15 seconds. Bin Laden was shot twice, once in the chest and once in the head, by SEALs who had been specifically trained for this moment. The man who had evaded capture for nearly 10 years died instantly, his body falling to the floor of the bedroom where he had spent his final terrified minutes. What followed was a rapid but thorough collection of intelligence materials from throughout the compound. Hard drives, documents, and personal effects were gathered and removed as the SEALs prepared for extraction. The entire operation, from insertion to departure, lasted exactly 25 minutes. Less time than bin Laden's daily walks in the courtyard. The helicopter extraction was completed without incident, despite concerns about Pakistani military response. As the aircraft departed Pakistani airspace, they carried with them not only bin Laden's body, but also a treasure trove of intelligence that would lead to the dismantling of remaining al-Qaeda networks worldwide. But perhaps the most significant aspect of bin Laden's death wasn't the military precision of the operation. It was the pathetic nature of his final moments. The man who had proclaimed himself a holy warrior died cowering behind a woman, trapped in a room of his own making, eliminated by the very forces he had spent his life evading. The confirmation of Osama bin Laden's death came at 1:25 a.m. Pakistani time, when DNA analysis conducted on-site confirmed that the body recovered from the compound was indeed that of the world's most wanted terrorist. The man who had terrorized the globe for over a decade was dead, but the full scope of what investigators discovered in his final refuge would prove to be almost as shocking as his death itself. The intelligence haul recovered from the compound painted a disturbing picture of bin Laden's final years. Hundreds of documents revealed a man increasingly isolated from his own organization, reduced to writing letters that were never sent and recording videos that were never distributed. His global terrorist network had largely abandoned him, leaving him dependent on a handful of couriers who were themselves under constant surveillance. Personal items recovered from his bedroom told an even more pathetic story. Investigators found hair dye that bin Laden had been using to maintain his appearance in propaganda videos, medications for kidney ailments that had plagued him for years, and a collection of personal letters that revealed his growing paranoia and fear. The man who had projected an image of strength and determination was revealed to be a physically deteriorating recluse living in constant terror. Perhaps most disturbing were the discoveries related to his daily routine in the compound. Investigators found evidence that bin Laden had not left the third floor of the building in over 8 months before his death. His world had shrunk to a few rooms where he spent his time watching news coverage of his own declining influence, isolated from the world he had tried to reshape through violence. The compound's other residents, the courier families who had maintained bin Laden's cover, provided additional insights into his psychological state during his final months. Survivor testimony described a man who had become increasingly erratic, prone to angry outbursts when news reports suggested his organization was weakening and obsessed with his legacy in ways that bordered on delusion. Intelligence analysis of recovered communications revealed that bin Laden's final months were marked by repeated attempts to regain control of terrorist operations that had moved beyond his influence. His letters to remaining al-Qaeda cells were largely ignored, and his strategic guidance was considered outdated by operatives who were adapting to new realities on the ground. The physical evidence of his living conditions was equally revealing. The bedroom where he died contained makeshift furniture, books on Islamic theology that showed signs of obsessive reading, and a small collection of personal weapons that had proved useless during the final assault. The man who had once commanded resources worth millions of dollars died in conditions that resembled those of a middle-class prisoner. But perhaps the most significant discovery was what investigators didn't find. There were no escape plans that extended beyond the compound walls, no evidence of ongoing operational planning, and no indication that bin Laden had any realistic expectation of survival if his location was discovered. The man who had evaded capture for nearly 10 years had essentially given up hope of continued freedom. The transformation from global terrorist leader to isolated prisoner had been complete long before the night of his death. Osama bin Laden had become a victim of his own success in creating fear. The terror he had unleashed had eventually consumed him, leaving him trapped in a prison of his own making, waiting for an end that came with sudden, brutal finality. The death of Osama bin Laden on May 3, 2011, represented more than just the end of the most expensive manhunt in history. It revealed the ultimate fate of a man who had chosen to live as the world's most wanted fugitive. He died alone, afraid, and ultimately isolated from the very movement he had once led. The brutal irony of his final hours cannot be overlooked. A man who had spent his career evading capture died in the ultimate surprise assault, with no warning and no opportunity for the dramatic final stand he had probably imagined. The fortress he had built to protect himself became his tomb, and the isolation he had chosen to avoid capture became the very thing that made his death inevitable. Intelligence analysis conducted in the months following the raid confirmed that bin Laden's influence had been declining for years before his death. His elimination, while symbolically important, had little practical impact on ongoing operations that had evolved beyond his control. He died not as the leader of a movement, but as a relic of an earlier era that the world had already begun to move past. The compound in Abbottabad was demolished by Pakistani authorities within months of the raid, erasing the physical evidence of bin Laden's final refuge. But the intelligence recovered from those rooms continues to provide insights into the mind of a man whose choices led inevitably to his own destruction. The story of Osama bin Laden's final hours serves as a reminder that those who choose to live as fugitives ultimately become prisoners of their own fear. The man who sought to remain hidden from the world ended his life as a captive of that same isolation, trapped in a cage of his own making, waiting for an end that came with swift and final justice. His death marked not just the conclusion of a manhunt, but the end of an era. The brutal last hours of Osama bin Laden represent the ultimate failure of a life spent in hiding, leaving behind nothing but the hollow legacy of a man who chose darkness and died alone in it. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.